History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 2. The First Civilizations. Chapter 5. The Beginnings of Civilization in Eastern Asia. This civilization has been given the name Harappan because one of its great sites is in the city of Harappa on a tributary of the Indus. There is, they reveal, such site at Mohenjo-daro. Others are being discovered. Together, they reveal human beings highly organized and capable of carefully regulated collective works on a scale equaling those of Egypt and Mesopotamia. There were large granaries in the cities, and weights and measures seem to have been standardized over a large area. It is a clear that a well developed culture was established by 2250 BC and lasted for something like 400 years and with very little change. The two cities, which are its greatest monuments, may have contained more than 30,000 people each. This says much for the agriculture which sustained them. The region was then far from being the arid zone it later became. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were between 2 and 2.5 miles in circumference, and the uniformity and complexity of their building speaks for a high degree of administrative and organizational skill. They each had a citadel and a residential area. Streets of houses were laid out on rectangular grid planes and made of brick of standardized sizes. Both the elaborate and effective drainage systems and the internal layout of the houses show a strong concern for bathing and cleanliness. In some streets of Harappa, nearly every house has a bathroom. Perhaps it is not fanciful to see in this some of the first manifestations of which the enduring feature of Indian religion, the bathing and ritual ablutions which are still important to Hindus. Before 2000 BC, these cities were trading far afield and living an economic life of some complexity. A great dockyard connected by a mile long canal to the sea at Lothal, 400 miles south of Mohenjo-daro, suggests the importance of an external trade which reached, though, the Persian Gulf as far north as Mesopotamia. In the Harappan cities themselves, evidence survives of specialized craftsmen drawing their materials from a wide area and subsequently sending out again across its length and breadth the products of their skill. This civilization has cotton cloth, the first of which we have evidence, which was plentiful enough to wrap bales of goods for export, whose cordage was sealed with seals found at Lothal. These seals are part of our evidence for Harappan literacy, for few inscriptions on fragments of pottery are all that supplements them and provides the first traces of Indian writings, the seals of which are about 2500 that survive, provide some of our best clues to Harappan ideas. The pictographs on the seals run from right to left. Animals often appear on them and may represent 6 seasons into which the year was divided. Many words on the seal remain unreadable, but it now seems at least likely that they are part of a language akin to the Dravidian tongues still used in the southern parts of India. Ideas and techniques from the Indus spread throughout Sindh and the Punjab and down the west coast of Gujarat. The process took centuries, and the picture revealed by archaeology is too confused for a consistent pattern to emerge. Where its influence did not reach, the Ganges Valley, the other great silt rich area where large populations could live, and the southeast. Different cultural processes were at work, and they have left nothing so spectacular behind them. Some of India's culture must be derived from other sources. There are traces elsewhere of Chinese influence, but it is hard to be positive. Rice, for example, began to grow in India in the Ganges Valley. We simply do not know where it came from, but one possibility is China or Southeast Asia, on which coasts it was grown from about 3000 BC. 2000 years later, this crucial item in Indian diet was used over most of the north. Nor do we know why the first Indian civilizations began to decline, though their passing can be roughly dated. The devastating floods of the Indus or the uncontrollable alteration of its course may have wrecked the delicate balance of the agriculture on its banks. The forest may have been destroyed by tree felling to provide fuel for the brick kilns on which Harappan building depended. But perhaps there were also other agencies at work. Skeletons, possibly those of men killed by time, were found in the streets of Mohenjo-daro. Harappan civilization seems to end in the Indus Valley about 1750 BC, and this coincides strikingly with the eruption into Indian history of one of the great creative forces, the invading Aryans. Though scholars do not favor the idea that invaders destroyed the Indian valley cities. Perhaps the newcomers entered a land already devastated by over exploitation and natural disorders. Strictly speaking, Aryan is a linguistic term like Indo European. Nonetheless, it has customarily and conveniently been used to identify one group of those Indo European peoples whose movements make up so much of the dynamic of the ancient history in other parts of the old world after 2000 BC. At about the time when the other Indo Europeans were flowing into Iran, somewhere about 1750 BC, a great influx of Aryan begins to enter India from the Hindu Kush. This was the beginning of the centuries during which waves of three migrants washed deeper and deeper into the Indus Valley and the Punjab and eventually reached the upper Ganges. They did not obliterate the native peoples, though the Indus Valley civilization crumbled. No doubt much violence marked their coming, for the Aryans were warriors and nomads, armed with bronze weapons, bringing horses and chariots, but they settled, and there are plenty of signs that the native populations lived on with them, keeping their own beliefs and practices alive. There is much archaeological evidence of the fusion of Harappan with later ways. However qualified, this was an early example of the assimilation of cultures, which was always to characterize Indian society and was eventually to underlie classical Hinduism's remarkable digestive power. It seems clear that the Aryans brought to India no culture so advanced as that of the Harappans. It is a little like the story of the coming of Indo Europeans in the Aegean. Writing, for example, disappears and does not emerge again until the middle of the first millennium BC. Cities too have to be reinvented, and when they are again to be found, they lack the elaboration and order of their Indus Valley predecessors. Instead, the Aryans appear slowly to have given up their pastoral habits and settled into agricultural life, spreading east and south from their original settlement areas in a sprawl of villages. This took centuries. Not until the coming of the iron was it complete and the Ganges Valley colonized. Iron implements made cultivation easier. Meanwhile, together with this physical opening up of the northern plains, Aryan culture had made two decisive contributions to the Indian history in its religious and in its social institutions. The Aryans laid the foundations of the religion which had been the heart of Indian civilization. Theirs centered on sacrificial concepts, though sacrifice, the process of creation which the gods achieved at the beginning of time, was to be endlessly repeated. Agni, the god of fire, was very important because it was through his sacrificial flames that men could reach the gods. Great importance and standing was given to the Brahmans, the priests who presided over these ceremonies. There was a pantheon of gods, of whom two of the most important were Varuna, god of the heavens, controller of the natural order and the embodiment of justice, and Indra, the warrior god, who year after year slew a dragon and thus released again the heavenly waters which came with the breaking of the monsoon. We learn about them from the Rig Veda, a collection of more than 1,000 hymns performed during sacrifice, collected for the first time in about 1000 BC, but certainly accumulated over centuries. It is one of our most important sources for the history, not only of the Indian religion but also of the Aryan society. The Rig Veda seems to reflect an Aryan culture as it has been shaped by the settlement in India and not the Aryan culture as it had existed at earlier times. It is like Homer, the eventual written form of a body of oral tradition, but quite different in being much less difficult to use as a historical source, since its status is much more certain. Its sanctity made its memorization in exact form essential, and though the Rig Veda was not to be written down until after 1300 AD, it was then still almost certainly largely uncorrupted from its original form. Together with the later Vedic hymns, prose works, it is our best source for Aryan India, whose archaeology is cramped for a long time because building materials less durable than the brick of the Indus Valley cities were used in its towns and temples. There is a suggestion again of the world of Homer in the world revealed by the Rig Veda, which is one of Bronze Age barbarians. Some archaeologists now believe they can identify in the hymns references to the destruction of the Harappan cities. Iron is not mentioned and appears only to have come to India after 1000 BC. There is an argument about how late and what source. The setting of the hymns is a land which stretches from the western banks of the Indus to the Ganges, inhabited by Aryan peoples and dark skinned native inhabitants. These formed societies whose fundamental units were families and tribes, and the legacies of these were less enduring than the pattern of Aryan social organization, even eventually emerges and which we call caste. About the early history of this vast and complicated subject and its implications, it is impossible to speak with assurance. Once the rules of caste were written down, they appeared as a hard and solid structure incapable of variation. Yet this did not happen until caste had been in existence for hundreds of years, during which it was still flexible and evolving. Its root appears to be a recognition of the fundamental class divisions of the settled agricultural society, a warrior aristocracy, Kashtriyas, priestly Brahmans, and the ordinary peasant farmers, Vaishyas. There are the earliest divisions of Aryan society which can be observed and seen not to have been exclusive. Movement between them were possible. The only unleapable barrier in early times seemed to have been that between non Aryans and Aryans. One of the words used to denote the aboriginal inhabitants of India by the Aryans was Dasa, which came eventually to denote slave. To the occupational categories was soon added a fourth category for non Aryans. Clearly, it rested on a wish practiced to preserve racial integrity. These were the Shudras or unclean, who might not study or hear the Vedic hymns. This structure has been elaborated almost ever since further divisions and subdivisions appeared as society became more complex and movements within the original threefold structure took place. In this, the Brahmans, the highest class, played a crucial role. Landowners and merchants came to be distinguished from farmers. The first were called Vashyas and Shudras became cultivators. Marriage and eating taboos were codified. The process gradually led to the appearance of a caste system as we know it today. A vast number of castes and subcastes slowly inserted themselves into the system. Their obligations and demands eventually became a primary regulator of Indian society, perhaps the only significant one in many Indians' lives. By modern times, there were thousands of jatis, local castes, with members restricted to marrying within them, eating only food cooked by fellow members and obeying their regulations. Usually, too, a caste limited those who belonged to it to the practice of one craft or profession. For this reason, as well as because of the traditional ties of the tribe, family, and locality, and the distribution of wealth, the structure of power in Indian society, right down to the present day, has had much more to it than formal political institutions and central authority. In early times, Aryan tribal society threw up kings who emerged, no doubt, because of military skill. Gradually, some of them acquired something like divine sanction, though this must always have depended on a nice balance of relations with the Brahman caste. But this was not the only political pattern. Not all Aryans accepted this evolution. By about 600 BC, when some of the detail of the early Indian political history at last begins to be dimly discernible through a mass of legend and myth, two sorts of political communities can be discerned. One, non monarchical, tending to survive in the hilly north, and one monarchical, established in the Ganges Valley. This reflected centuries of steady pressure by the Aryans towards the east and south, during which peaceful settlement and intermarriage seem to have played as big a part as conquest. Gradually, during this era, the center of gravity of Aryan India had shifted from the Punjab to the Ganges Valley, as Aryan culture was adopted by the people already there. As we emerge from the twilight zone of the Vedic kingdoms, it is clear that they established something like a cultural unity in the northern India. The Ganges Valley was by the 7th century BC the great center of Indian population. It may be that the cultivation of rice made this possible. A second age of Indian cities began there. The first of them, marketplaces and centers of manufacture, to judge by the way they brought together specialized craftsmen. The Great Plains, together with the development of the armies on the larger and well equipped scale, we hear of the use of elephants, favored the consolidation of larger political units. At the end of the 7th century BC, northern India was organized in 16 kingdoms. Though how this happened and how they were related to one another is still hard to disentangle from their mythology. Nonetheless, the existence of coinage and the beginnings of writings make it likely that they had governments of growing solidity and regularity. The process in which they emerged are touched on in some of the earliest literary sources from Indian history. The Brahmanas, text composed during this period when Aryan culture came to dominate the Ganges Valley, circa 800 to 600 BC. But more about them and the great names involved can be found in later documents, above all in two great Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The present texts are the result of constant revision from about 400 BC to 400 AD, when they were written down as we know them for the first time. So their interpretation is not easy. In consequence, it remains hard to get at the political and administrative reality behind, say, the kingdom of Magadha, based on the southern Bihar, which emerged eventually as the preponderant power and was to be the core of the first historical empires of India. On the other hand, and possibly more importantly, the evidence is clear that the Ganges Valley was already what it was to remain, the seat of empire, its cultural domination assured as the center of Indian civilization, the future Hindustan. The later Vedic texts and the general richness of the Aryan literary record make it all too easy to forget the existence of half the subcontinent. Written evidence tends to confine Indian history down to this point and after, to the history of the North. The state of archaeological and historical scholarship also reflects and further explains the concentration of attention on northern India. There is just much more known about it in the ancient times than about the South. But there are also better and less accidental justifications for such emphasis. The archaeological evidence shows, for example, a clear and continuing cultural lag in this early period between the area of the Indus system and the rest of India, to which it may be remarked the river was to give its name. Enlightenment, if it may be so expressed, came from the north. In the south, near modern Mysore, settlements roughly contemporaneous with Harappa show no trace of metal, though there is evidence of domesticated cattle and goats. Bronze and copper only begin to appear at some time after the Aryan arrival in the north. Once outside the Indus system, too, there are no contemporary metal sculptures, no seals, and fewer terracotta figures. In Kashmir and eastern Bengal, there are strong evidences of Stone Age cultures with affinities with those of South China. But it is at least clear that whatever the local characteristics of the Indian cultures with which they were in contact and within the limits imposed by geography, first Harappan and then Aryan civilization were dominant. They gradually asserted themselves towards Bengal and the Ganges Valley, down the west coast towards Gujarat, and in the central highlands of the subcontinent. This is the pattern of the Dark Age, and when we reach that of history, there is not much additional light. The survival of Dravidian languages in the south shows the region's persistent isolation. Topography explains much of it. The Deccan has always been cut off from the north by the jungle clad mountains, the Vindhya. Internally, too, the south is broken and hilly, and this did not favor the building of large states as did the open plains of the north. Instead, South India remained fragmented, some of its peoples persisting thanks to their inaccessibility in the hunting and gathering cultures of a tribe age. Others, by a different accident of geography, turned to the seas, another contrast with the predominantly agrarian empires of the north. Millions of people must have been affected by the changes so far described. Estimates of ancient populations are notoriously unreliable. India's has been put at about 25 million in 400 BC, which would be roughly a quarter of the whole population of the world at that time. The importance of India's early history, nevertheless, lies in the way it laid down the patterns still shaping the lives of even larger numbers today, rather than in its impact on big populations in antiquity. This is above all true of religion. Hinduism crystallized in the first millennium BC, a great world religion. Buddhism was also launched then in India. It was eventually to dominate wide areas of Asia. What men do not shape by what they believe, they can do. It is the making of a culture that is the pulse of Indian history, not the making of a nation or an economy, and to this culture, religion was central. The deepest roots of the Indian religious and philosophical synthesis go very deep indeed. One of the great popular cult figures of the Hindu pantheon today is Shiva, in whose worship many early fertility cults have been brought together. A seal from Mohenjo-daro already shows a figure who looks like an early Shiva, and stones like the lingam found in modern temples. The phallic cult object, which is his emblem, have been found in the Harappan cities. There is some presumptive evidence, therefore, for the view that worship of Shiva may be the oldest surviving religious cult in the world. Though he has assimilated many important Aryan characteristics, he is pre Aryan and survives in all his multifaceted power, still an object of veneration in the 20th century. Nor is Shiva the only possible survival from the remote past of the Indus civilization. Other Harappan seals seem to suggest a religious world centered about a mother goddess and a bull. This bull survives to this day, the Nandi of countless village shrines all over Hindu India, and newly vigorous in his latest incarnation as the electoral symbol of the Congress Party. Vishnu, another focus of modern popular Hindu devotion, is much more an Aryan. Vishnu joined hundreds of local gods and goddesses still worshipped today to form the Hindu pantheon. Yet his cult is far from being either the only or the best evidence of the Aryan contribution to Hinduism. Whatever survived from the Harappan or even pre Harappan past, the major philosophical and speculative traditions of Hinduism stem from Vedic religion. These are the Aryan legacy. To this day, Sanskrit is the language of religious learning. It transcends ethnic divisions, being used in the Dravidian speaking south as much as in the north by Brahman. It was a great cultural adhesive, and so was religion it carried. The Vedic hymns provided the nucleus for the system of religious thought, more abstract and philosophical than primitive animism. Out of Aryan notion of hell and paradise, the house of clay and the world of fathers, there gradually evolved the belief that action in life determine human destiny. An immense, all embracing structure of thought slowly emerged, a worldview in which all things are linked in a huge web of beings. Souls might pass through different forms in this immense whole. They might move up or down the scale of being, between castes, for example, or even between human and animal worlds. The idea of transmigration from life to life, its forms determined by proper behavior, was linked to the idea of purgation and renewal, to the trust in liberation from the transitory, accidental, and apparent, and to belief in the eventual identity of soul and absolute being in Brahma, the creative principle. The duty of the believer was the observation of dharma, a virtually untranslatable concept, but one which embodies something of the Western ideas of natural law of justice and something of the idea that men owed respect and obedience to the duties of their station.